You keep doing bumpers like that, the congressman may come back again.
Hey, I tell you what, every time I come in, I want that to be my intro music. You come into the Eagles Hotel California, it doesn't get any better than that.
Make a note over there in the booth. Congressman,
I claim that as my song.
Congressman Michael Guest, who is played in by the Eagles now every time that he comes on SuperTalk, joining us here in the studio. How you doing, Michael?
I'm great. Good to see you today. Good to be home in Mississippi. Be returning to Washington next week, but it's always nice to be home and spending time with my family and getting to see my friends and getting to see people in person. So it's great to see the things beginning to return to a little semblance of normal where you can actually go out and see people. I got to go to a couple of dinners this week that I've not been able to go to before because people have been scared to have those types of events. So even with the uptick in COVID-19 cases, I'm glad to see that we're starting to get back to kind of life as we used to know it before everything shut down, early to mid-March.
Well, and it was a pleasant surprise that you turned up in the green room because I thought you were on the phone or on Zoom or something.
Look, you and I talked, during the break. It's so much better to be able to sit across from one another and carry on a conversation than to try to do that by Zoom or try to do that by cell phone. So thank y'all for having us in, and particularly for me, someone who's technologically challenged, to be able to do this face-to-face and not have to worry about using technology for us to communicate was very relieving.
Well, you managed to get the headphones on first try.
That's right.
So
I got those on right, and I got the left ear on the left side and the right ear on the right. So far, knock on wood, I've not made any mistakes yet.
Hey, perfection is all we can hope for, right?
And if we do, there's always next week, and we'll try to have a better week.
Now, speaking of next week, you got a busy week next week coming up, don't you?
We do. We return to Washington next week. We'll be voting on legislation. The key piece of legislation we'll be taking up first will be the Criminal Justice Reform Act. There's actually two competing bills. There's a Republican bill and a Democratic bill. The Democratic bill was introduced in the Senate. The Democratic bill was introduced in the House by Speaker Pelosi. The bill was written without any input of the Republicans. And so since the Republicans were shut out during that legislative writing process, so we felt it was necessary that we introduce legislation that we felt also dealt with criminal justice reform. I'll tell you that some of the language in those bills is very similar. There's other things such as in the Democratic bill, they seek to do away with qualified immunity. That's really a no-starter with people within the Republican Party. We understand that qualified immunity is very important to protect our men and women of law enforcement from lawsuits. What qualified immunity is, it's not blanket immunity. It doesn't say you cannot sue law enforcement for any reason at all. But qualified immunity says that if an officer is acting within the scope and course of his duties and is acting in a reasonable manner, then that individual is shielded from lawsuits. And I think law enforcement, we've got to have that if we are going to be able to recruit and retain certified law enforcement officers who are going to be out there protecting our community. And they already do a very dangerous job. And I think, that was seen this week. We had the funeral for Deputy Blair. Deputy Blair was killed last Friday as he was transporting an individual to Region 8 for a mental evaluation, not because that individual was actually in trouble, but because that individual had mental issues. And that individual's family had filed through the Chancery Court system for mental evaluation to try to have that person receive the help that they need. And so a deputy was helping an individual ultimately get what they thought would be the mental treatment that they needed, and that deputy was killed, a deputy that had served 5 decades in communities throughout our state in various law enforcement capacities. And so when we have individuals and we're already telling them, hey, you're going to be putting your life on the line each and every day that you go to work, you're going to be subject to being assaulted, you're going to be subject to, in some cases, being placed in situations to where you may lose your life, and then also we're going to take away qualified immunity and we're going to open you up to lawsuits on a daily basis. It is going to be difficult, if not impossible, to recruit and retain those individuals.
Well, and I think retain is the important word. We've seen that in Atlanta over the last couple of days because we've got a lot of people that have just called in. They a lot of law enforcement over there after the announcement was made about the charges in the Rayshard Brooks killing over in Atlanta. that did the old thing that I think everybody has done at some point or another, where you call in the boss and go, "Hey, boss, I'm sick. I can't come in today," and they've had a shortage of people on the streets in Atlanta for a couple of days.
That's right, and that impacts public safety, and so in Atlanta you had a case in which the DA, prior to the investigation being completed by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, so GBI is still finishing that investigation, unilaterally without consulting the grand jury, decides to bring charges against not one but both the officers who were involved in that altercation. Being a former prosecutor, I hate to second guess what prosecutors' decisions that they make, because I'm not privy to all the information that prosecutor has. I have seen on television at least 1 to 2 different surveillance videos or body cam videos of what happened, but as I understand, there were probably many more than that. There are witnesses that they've talked to, statements that they've been able to obtain, and so I hate to second guess that, but also, I understand in those situations it's important, in my opinion, to wait for the investigation to be completed before you make that decision, because you're then making the decision without all the information. And I also felt it was important when I was DA for officer-involved shootings to be reviewed by the grand jury. Every shooting in which an officer was involved, regardless of whether I felt the officer was in the right or in the wrong, those cases were presented to the grand jury, because ultimately the grand jury is a body of citizens who are impaneled to make those decisions. I was an elected official, but I felt like that those decisions were better made and better reviewed by the grand jury. And I believe that those officers who are now calling in sick and who are concerned about what they believe to be prosecutorial overreach by the DA, if those decisions would have been made by the grand jury, would have been much more comfortable. It is disturbing when you read, that the DA in this case is currently under investigation, and that he has a very difficult re-election occurring in August. And so that leads you to believe, or leads you to at least question, were the fact that this was rushed into, was it politically motivated? Did this DA feel like that he was going to have a very difficult re-election and just a few weeks ahead, and so he went ahead and moved forward with charges again before the investigation was complete, in an attempt to maintain his office and to fend off his challenger?
Well, it's just a bad look, and I'm sorry, when there's this much smoke, you have to assume there's some kind of fire under there somewhere.
You're exactly right. And the thing, we've got to separate what happened in Atlanta, with what happened in Minnesota. I mean, that case was a clear case where law enforcement was in the wrong. The investigation happened very quickly. Charges were brought, and I think everybody that I've spoken with believe that those officers deserve and need to be charged, that it was clearly a legal violation. I think what we saw in Atlanta is much more of a situation to where, was that, and I don't know what the officer said, I don't know what his statement was, but, I could believe that he is chasing someone that he has just been involved in a physical altercation with. He sees that individual point a weapon at him. I don't know if the officer knew that weapon was a taser, or if the officer felt that might have been his partner's handgun. And so, to me, that is a case that needed additional investigation and needed to be properly vetted before charges were brought. And it seems to me that there was a rush to judgment in that case.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're all about right now, is a rush to judgment on everything, it seems like. That's just the way America's operating at the moment. But I do find it interesting, one other fact about that. The DA that rushed forward with these charges previously had classified a taser as a deadly weapon.
And clearly it is, a taser, it is non-lethal, and so to me a deadly weapon would only be some sort of firearm. But if that officer has already said, or if that DA has already said that is a deadly weapon, then that officer has the right to use self-defense.
Exactly. That's what you would think. A little inconsistent here in the attitudes, which makes him seem a bit opportunistic to me.
I would agree.
Which is not helping anything. We got enough to talk about right now in America. We don't need somebody piling on like this for their own self-interest, my opinion.
I agree 100%.
Congressman Michael Guest in the studio with us. We we barely scratched the surface, Michael. We got a lot more to talk about.
We'll have to speed it up second segment.
Well, we're going to pile it in next here on the Gallo Show.
I think I'm going to stick with the Eagles in Hotel California.
Okay.
That's more of my generation.
My opinion, that's a wise choice. Congressman Michael Guest with us here on the Gallo Show. You did something unique that I want to make sure we talk about because we're hearing a lot of talk about the protest around the country, and everybody has their right to protest. Everybody has their right to make their voice be heard. You don't have the right to go and throw a brick through somebody's window and steal their stuff because you say you're upset about something else. We've had a lot of violence, a lot of looting, a lot of riots around the country, and everybody's just kind of like, well, yeah, but let's not talk about that right now. And that you went in the opposite direction this week.
You know, we did. We introduced a resolution this week condemning the violence that we saw rise out of the protest. And we were very careful as we laid out that resolution, that we supported the peaceful protests that arose out of the tragic death of George Floyd. Every person that I have spoken with agrees that what happened to George Floyd was a crime. It was a tragedy. It never should have happened. And again, every person that I've agreed with understands that people have a right to peacefully protest. We have a First Amendment right of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to petition our government against things that we feel are wrong. But when we have violent extremists who are using those peaceful protests to really just sow chaos throughout our inner cities and our communities, I think we've got to come in and we've got to condemn that. You know, we saw out of those peaceful protests that we would see individuals and violent groups who were looting, who were stealing, who were targeting law enforcement officers, assaulting civilians, burning and destroying public and private property. And at some point, we've got to call those people out and say, that's wrong. We agree with your right to protest, and we stand with you as you protest. And we may disagree at times on certain things, but I think we all have to agree that we cannot allow peaceful protests to be hijacked and then to see the chaos and destruction that arose out of in many of our urban centers the days following the death of George Floyd. You think of what happened in Minneapolis, what happened in New York, what happened in Atlanta, what happened in St. Louis, what happened in California. You know, we had officers who were shot. We had an officer that was killed in California. We had individuals who were killed. We had buildings that were burned. And so, you know, after talking with people in my community and kind of hearing the outrage that they had, and again, the outrage was not at the protests themselves, but that the protests had been hijacked, you know, I introduced a resolution. Now, I do not believe that this resolution will ever be taken up for a vote in the House of Representatives. I do not believe that Nancy Pelosi will ever let this legislation come to the floor. But I felt strongly enough about it that I felt somebody needs to stand up, somebody needs to introduce some sort of resolution that would condemn the violence and that would ask that those individuals who were responsible for committing these acts of violence be held responsible. And so we introduced that this week. We hope that there will be other members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, who will join us and co-sponsor this resolution. And again, I do not believe that this resolution will ever be voted on by the House, but it was important to me to express not just how I felt, but how the people of the 3rd Congressional District felt after seeing the several days of chaos that arose out of peaceful protest.
Well, I do find it ironic that the people that are protesting to make sure that other people are held responsible for their actions don't want to be held responsible for their actions.
That's exactly right. You know, you have people who are protesting because because there was a violent act committed on an individual, and some of those individuals are then out committing violent acts on other individuals. And again, they wanted, and the officers who were involved in that case have been held responsible. They have been charged. They will have their day in court. But even after charges were brought, we still continued to see violence, and that violence continued up until the president stepped in and had a press conference in the Rose Garden and says, look, if you do not, speaking to the governors and speaking to the mayors of these major cities, if you do not enforce the rule of law, I will. And very quickly, we saw the protests then begin to turn back toward peaceful protest. And so I think it took someone like the president who was threatening to send in our National Guard and our military to put down what was becoming an insurrection to get us back to enforcing the rule of law, back toward peaceful protest so that we could have the dialogue of criminal justice reform. Now we can talk about what do we need to do to change our criminal justice system to make it safer on the people who are being policed, but also safer on law enforcement. One thing about the criminal justice bill that we're going to be voting on, at least the Republican version, one of the things in there that I'm very excited about is there's additional funds for the use of body cameras. Body cameras, I think, are great in the fact that they capture the interaction between law enforcement and the public, and so there is no question about what was said, who said what, who did what. All of that is being recorded. I have found that the body cameras are also great pieces of evidence when law enforcement responds to a crime. But what it does is it protects citizens from officers who may be having a bad day and who may not treat them as well as they should. But it also protects the law enforcement from people making false claims that they were verbally or physically abused. And so there's $500 million in the criminal justice reform bill for that. There's money in there for training. I am 100% behind training. I think we need to have the best trained law enforcement that we can possibly afford. And so there's federal money in there to train them, training on things such as de-escalation tactics. So if they respond to a scene and they have a suspect there, an individual there who is hostile, what can we do to de-escalate that situation so we don't have to get to the point where we're having to use force? And then sometimes force, as we saw in Atlanta, turns into deadly force. And so there are a lot of good things in there. There's a registration in there to make sure that when force is used, that is reported to the FBI. There's information in there that you have to report no-knock warrants. A no-knock warrant is when you have law enforcement who is executing a search warrant. They're responding to a home where they have believed that the suspect is armed. There are certain situations where they can petition the judge to give them a no-knock warrant, which would allow them to enter the home without first knocking and announcing. But we don't have a registration right now to record those events. How many times do we issue no-knock warrants? When we do issue those no-knock warrants, are there the occasions in which there are violent interactions between law enforcement and the individuals at the home? And so this would record that. This would help gather data. And so there's a lot of good things in this bill that I think would not only protect the public in general, but would also protect our law enforcement community. And it does not do away, at least the Senate version, the Republican bill, with the qualified immunity that we talked about earlier.
Well, and that's the key, because a lot of these things that you're talking about seem like common sense, but perfect example, body cameras. We've heard reports from around the country that they have body cameras, but, they just didn't happen to be turned on at this moment or that moment, which doesn't help public confidence, doesn't help the conversation that we're having right now. And there's been talk about linking federal funding to having the body cameras on when they have them.
And the other thing is there's money in this bill also for the storage of those body camera videos. And so, the body camera, the equipment themselves is one piece of the puzzle. Then we also have to deal with the storage aspect because, law enforcement work either 8 or 12-hour shifts, depending on how their department is set up. You've got 12 hours of continuous video that is running for however many officers are in that department or on that shift. It takes up a great deal of storage capacity, and so this bill also would allow money to be used to properly store and categorize those videos. And you're exactly right. Many of our larger departments do have access to body cameras, but you look at some of your more rural departments, some of your rural chiefs of police or police departments, even some of your rural sheriff's departments, they don't have the funding to purchase those body cams. And so they're not going to be able to afford those without the federal government coming in and making those funds available. And so you're exactly right. We've got to make sure that not only are we providing that, but we're providing the proper training so that we're capturing those interactions and we don't have officers who are then turning off their videos or failing to turn their videos on because that would defeat the purpose of what we're trying to do with body camera video.
Justice Roberts, is he off your Christmas card list now?
I was deeply disturbed by him, I guess, ruling with the liberal members of our Supreme Court I think that was wrong. I think anything that one president can issue by executive order, the following president should be able to undo by executive order, but that was not the case in DACA.
And we'll just have to wait and see how it unfolds from here. Something tells me that's not the end of this story.
I think we're going to see round 2 at some point.
Yeah, definitely. You're back in Washington next week,
Yes,
right?
sir. Dave, thank you for having me.
Anytime, sir. Congressman Michael Guest, always a pleasure to have him in the studio. We continue on the Gallo Show on a Friday morning.